Assalamu alaikum, hope everyone is doing well. Today we'll be going over pointing fragments, so let's get right into it. So before we look at the fragment itself, let's go over pointing words. A pointing word, ismul ishara, is an ism that is used to literally point to an object, and there are two types. If you want to point to something close, then the pointing word used is this and these. For example, this key when pointing to something singular, and these keys when pointing to something plural. And if you want to point to something far, then the pointing word used is that and those. For example, we have that star when pointing to something singular, and those stars when pointing to something that's plural. Let's move on. Now you should know that most pointing words are stuck, meaning they look the same regardless of their state. So for example, we have hadha in rafa, hadha in nasab, and hadha in jar. They look exactly the same. So now let's take a look at these pointing words. So unlike in English, Arabic pointing words include a dual and a feminine version. So this first chart has the pointing words you would use if you want to point an object that's close to you. So all these either mean this or these depending on whether it's singular, dual, or plural. So let's go over them. First we have hadha, which is used if you want to point to something that's masculine and singular. Then you have hadhani, which is used if you want to point to two objects that are masculine, and then you have hadaini, which is the nasab and jar version, and then you have haulai, which is used if you want to point to something that's masculine and plural. And now you have female, which is hadhihi, if you want to point to something that is female and singular. And you have hatani, if you want to point to something that's dual and feminine. And you have hataini, if you want to point to something that's dual or feminine, but this is the nasab and jar version. And then you have haulai, if you want to point to something that's feminine and plural. So this would mean this would mean this would mean these two, and this would mean these and these when referring to three or more. And memorizing this chart is going to be really helpful in the future, so definitely recommend it. Now let's look at pointing words you would use if you want to point to an object that is far from you. We have dhalika, which we would use if you're pointing to something that's male and singular. And then we have dhanika, which you would use if you're pointing to something that is masculine and dual. And then you have dhainika, which is the nasab and jar version. And then you have ulaika if you want to point to something that's male and plural. And then we have tilka if you're pointing to something that's feminine and singular. And then we have thanika, which if you want to point to something that's feminine and dual. And we have tainika, which is the nasab and jar version. And then we have ulaika if you want to point to something that's feminine and plural. And you should definitely spend some time memorizing this chart. So now the pointing fragment. So this is the equation for the pointing fragment. Pointing fragment is known as ismul ishara mushara ilay. And you have ismul ishara, which is the pointing word. For example, hadha or dhalika. We just went over this. Then you have the mushara ilay, which is what you're pointing to. For example, that car. So the car would be the mushara ilay. Together is known as ismul ishara mushara ilay, which is the pointing fragment. Since we already went over the ismul ishara, let's go take a look at mushara ilay. So now the mushara ilay. This would be the object you're pointing to, for example, a book or a car. For the word to be a mushara ilay, it must have the following. It must be an ism with an al. It must come right after the pointing word, so right after hadha or dhalika, and it must match the pointing word in gender, number, and state. In reality, all four properties match because since you need an al for the mushara ilay, it becomes definite, so all four properties must match. So let's go over a few examples. Here we have dhalika al-kitabu. So dhalika is our pointing word, which is the ismul ishara. And then we have al-kitabu, which is the word we're pointing to. So for this to be the mushara ilay, it needs to meet a few conditions. It must begin with an al, which also means it's definite. Second, it must come right after a pointing word, which it does. And then it must match in gender, number, and status, which is does because this is masculine, masculine. And then singular, singular. And then this is Rafa because of the Dhamma right here. Then this is Rafa because, as we said, it's stuck, so you can't really see it. And this translates to that book. So this whole thing is a pointing fragment. Next we have tilka as-sayyaratu. So we have tilka as the ismul ishara, which is the pointing word, and then we have as-sayyaratu, which is the mushara ilay, because again it begins with an al, comes right after the pointing word, and it matches in gender, number, and status, because tilka is feminine and so is sayyaratu, and the number is singular and singular, and the status is rafa and rafa, which you can tell by the dhamma right here. And this whole thing together becomes that car, which is also a pointing fragment. Okay, next up we have hadhan al-babani. Hadhani is the ism al-ishara. This is the masculine dual form. And then we have al-babani, which will be our mushara ilay, because it begins with an al, meaning it's definite, comes right after a pointing word, and it matches in gender, which is masculine, it matches in number, which is dual, and it matches in status. And here it's rafa, so this is rafa, so this would mean these two doors. Here we have hatani sayyaratani. So hatani is going to be our ism al-ishara, right? And this is the feminine dual form. Then we have as-sayyaratani, which is the mushara ilay, and we know that because again begins with an al, comes right after a pointing word, it matches in gender, both are feminine, matches in number, both are dual, and it matches in status, here both are rafa. So this becomes these two cars. Okay, next we have ala ulaika nasi. So ala is our harfu jar because it's from a list of harfu jar. And then we have ulaika, which is going to be our pointing word. If you remember, this is either going to be the masculine or feminine plural pointing word. And then we have an-nasi, which is the mushara ilay. And we know that this has to be the mushara ilay because it starts with an ism, it comes right after the pointing word, and they match in gender, which means since this is masculine, this will be masculine. They match in number because this is plural and this is plural, and they match in status. This is jar, meaning this will be jar. And this whole thing together is a pointing fragment, which is ismul ishara mushara ilay, and this whole thing will be the majroor to the harfu jar. And so this translates to upon those people. Okay, and next up we have something similar. So we have fi ha'ula'il mu'minina. So fi is from our harfu jar list. And then we have ha'ula'i, which is going to be our ismul ishara because from our pointing word chart. And then we have the mushara ilay, which is al-mu'minina. And we know this is the mushara ilay because it begins with an al. It comes right after the pointing word, and it matches the pointing word in gender. So both of these are masculine. And then in number, both of these are plural. And then in status, since this is jar, this will also be jar. And this whole thing together is going to be the majroor of the harfu jar. And so this becomes in these people. Okay, so now you guys know the rule, you need to know the exception. So previously we learned that the pointing word and the word being pointed to will match in three things: in number, gender, and status. Also definiteness, but that's by default because you need to bring the al for the mushara ilay anyways. So this rule remains true as long as the word being pointed to is singular, dual, or a masculine plural. If it's a feminine plural, then an exception can occur. And the exception is feminine plural non-intelligent nouns will be treated as singular feminine. So what does this mean? This means that if you have a feminine plural non-intelligent noun as your mushara ilay, meaning the word being pointed to, then the pointing word that will be used, the ism al-ishara, will be a singular feminine word. So how do you tell if a noun is intelligent or non-intelligent? So in grammar, all nouns have the attribute of intelligence. They can either be intelligent or non-intelligent. So intelligent nouns are limited to humans, angels, and jinns, and non-intelligent is basically everything else. Obviously, this is limited to grammar. So if the word being pointed to is an intelligent feminine feminine plural noun, then the previous rule still applies. So for example, we have ha'ula'il muslimatu. So ha'ula'i is our feminine plural, and then al-muslimatu is going to be our feminine plural, but we're talking about Muslims here, which are human. Therefore, the rule still applies. So these still match in all four categories. So al-muslimatu is feminine, so is ha'ula'i. Al-muslimatu is plural, so it's ha'ula'i, and al-muslimatu is in rafa, so it's ha'ula'i, and both of them are definite because of the al right here. So this becomes these female Muslims. Same thing here, ula'ika al-muslimatu. Again, this is feminine plural, and again, this is also feminine plural. So this matches in gender because they're both feminine. This matches in status, they're both rafa. This matches in number, they're both plural. Therefore, ism al-ishara mushara ilay, our regular rule, those female Muslims. But if it's a non-intelligent plural feminine noun, then the exception applies, where you need to use a singular feminine pointing word. So let's look at that example. So here we have tilka an-nujumu. An-nujumu is a non-intelligent feminine plural because it just means stars. And they don't fall into the category of intelligence, which we said was humans, jinns, or angels. And therefore we use tilka, which is the singular feminine form, but we still translate it as those stars. And if the non-intelligent versus intelligent part is confusing, then you should know that this is the same as saying if it's a broken plural, then you would use the singular feminine pointing word. So here an-nujumu is a broken plural because it comes from the word najam, and there's no wow in the original word. Therefore now it's broken, and therefore you would use tilka. And so that's all for today, and I'll see you guys next time.